Hello, guys. Tonight we begin in the shady, dangerous, and not at all glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those dark figures that slipped through castle corridors and dark alleys to change history with a sword and a whisper. Although Hollywood presents them as attractive characters, the reality is that being a medieval assassin was arduous. Therefore, before getting comfortable, take a moment to give a like to the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Also, indicate in the comments where you're watching us from and what time it is. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from different parts of the world. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan to create a soft background murmur, and let's delve into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. No one in the Middle Ages woke up and said, "You know what? I would like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for days." Becoming an assassin was not a professional career. It was rather the last stop on a train where life had taken a terrible turn. Most medieval assassins were not mysterious loners trained in temples on mountaintops. They were desperate peasants, dishonored soldiers, ex-thieves with good aim, or people so far from society's radar that they could kill a man and still not appear in the census. If you were rich, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were set. But if you had just escaped from the data prison, you had a reputation for solving problems, and you could sneak into a tavern unseen. Congratulations. Someone, somewhere, was about to slide a bag of coins across the table and whisper a name. And that name was not fun. They weren't asking you to eliminate Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay was tempting, the job appalling, but when someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and, of course, no dental insurance. Also, let's not forget the absolute lack of job benefits. No pension, no glory, no afternoons off. You couldn't hang a sign that said silent eliminations by appointment. You just had to keep quiet, act quickly, and never, ever tell anyone what you did, much less out loud while having a beer at the tavern. Oh, yes, I'm a traveling carpet salesman. The stains don't come out. So yes, no one dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They got there because the world had crushed them and spat them out with a hood and a rusty dagger in hand. You were not the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and that you probably didn't live to enjoy the reward. Let's break down the first myth. Medieval assassins did not train by candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspiring flute music. There was no montage, no master, no motivational talks. If you learned something, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins were not trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb silently without sneezing. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a knife correctly. If not, well, stabbing someone is pretty intuitive, but getting away afterwards with both kidneys intact. That requires skill or luck. Usually just luck. There are no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety talks. They didn't teach you how to spot a double or where the nobles kept the exits from their bedrooms. You would discover it while you were hanging from the sill of a window, wondering if you had just sneaked into the service quarters again. Poison. It was a matter of trial and error, with much emphasis on the latter. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got dizzy and suspected their soup. Sometimes you drank from the wrong cup. There was no telephone hotline for medieval poisoning. Only hope, guesses based on herbs, and a strong stomach. Of course, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, maybe you had learned some skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe some veteran assassin taught you to walk without making noise on cobblestones. But having a mentor was unusual. It was uncommon and ephemeral because assassins do not retire. They disappear. Forget weapons training. You were not carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger that you stole from a guard, maybe a club if you were feeling elegant, and anything else that would fit under your cloak without making noise. So no, you were not a master of martial arts and shadows. You were a guy with calloused hands, silent steps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with alleys. Success did not come from training. It came from survival. You learn to kill by doing it fast, in any way, and disappearing before anyone could draw your face and stick it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, offering no graduation. Only bruises, bloodstains, and the disturbing feeling that you felt alone. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Money. Cold, heavy, noisy, deliciously spendable. The promise of having it got you into this. But the reality is that you were paid with lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want punctual service, without paperwork, and, if possible, without witnesses, including you. They offer a bag of silver, half now, the other half when the job's done. That is if they are generous. But here's the crux. When the job is done is code for, after we check that you haven't screwed it up, that you haven't put us in a bad place, that you haven't left any trace that gives us away, or that you haven't survived long enough to tell someone, so you do the job. You sneak between shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. It is not pretty or poetic. And when you return, yes, about the payment, I am very sorry, the client fled. Or even worse, they try to kill you. A knife in the stomach is cheaper than a bonus. And even when they pay you, it's never enough. Not for the risk, nor for the blood, nor for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral remorse. They give you a handful of coins, a dry nod, and a reminder. You were never here. In addition, fun fact, some contracts were false. Political traps. They asked you to assassinate someone dangerous. Then you discovered it was a decoy with guards waiting. Congratulations. You have just fallen into a trap with your name engraved on the gallows. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't go to court and file a complaint. Your lordship, I would like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of the murder contract. The only court you would see is the one where you would be the evidence. So you learn to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mainly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living off broken promises and disappearing before they destroyed you. So you have accepted the job. They lied to you about the salary. You're probably going to die. Now let's talk about equipment. Forget fantasy novels and video games. There were no retractable razors, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that folded perfectly into your boot. Your toolkit was anything you could steal, sharpen, or hide under a cloak without noise. If you were lucky, and I mean finding a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, you were lucky to have a good dagger. It was not ornate, nor curved like a dragon tooth. Just sharp, hopefully without rust, and hopefully not smelling like the last guy you stabbed. Poison. It existed, of course, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into wine. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some acted instantly. Others took hours. Some made the victim vomit for days and then recover. More angry and now very distrustful of the stew. Ropes were useful sometimes. You could strangle, climb, or tie something with them, but you had better know how to use them quickly because nothing kills the moment more than trying to fight with someone while muttering, "Wait, which one goes underneath?" The branches. Effective, yes, if you had one, knew how to throw it, and didn't try to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a florist. Most murders were at point-blank range. There was no time to shoot elegantly. You just had to be quick, quiet, and hopefully not get too dirty so you could escape. And there were no reinforcements. If your sword bent, broke, or fell into a well, you had to improvise. A slate tile, perhaps. A rusty nail. Worth a try. The buckle of a shoe. Used with intention. These were desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in the hems, in your boots, or inside hollow loaves of bread. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this job, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tweaks to the equipment between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it wouldn't fail you in the heat of the moment because, in the end, it wasn't the weapon that killed. It was just you, ill-equipped and expected to work miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins were not hired to eliminate random drunks in dark alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those people were very hard to kill. First, there were the guards. Not one or two, but dozens. Armed, armored, and well-fed. Some watched the front, others the back. Some just stood there, looking intimidating, daring you to even blink. You spent days memorizing the patrol patterns, the creaks of the doors, and the exact number of steps you had to climb before the asthmatic knight needed a breather. Secondly, there were just the walls. Castles did not have porches. They had doors, machicolations, and moats full of biting things. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included being able to be burned for spying. Thirdly, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look on your part, and they would be whispering to the captain of the guard faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins didn't just fight with swords. They fought against gossip. And medieval gossip travels at light speed if it means someone can keep their head. And lastly, your real paranoid target. Rightly so. These people were surrounded by traitors, relatives claiming titles, and dozens pretending to love them. They didn't eat without a taster. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on their door. Some even slept in trap beds or rotated rooms, like a deadly game of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a banquet. Yes, they will be drunk, but so will you. And you'll still have to get past the royal guards, 3 dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 tanked witnesses. Just getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as servant, bribing a maid, hiding in barrels. And when a moment finally came, you only had one chance. A precise, perfect, ghostly disappearance with no squeaks or blood during the night. Or you would become the next public example hanging from the castle gate with a sign that reads, "Good try." Let's be honest. When you imagine a medieval assassin, you probably imagine elegant black robes, leather straps, maybe a mysterious hood billowing in moonlight. In reality, you look like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Costumes in the Middle Ages weren't exactly haute couture. You didn't have custom capes or retractable armor. You had what you could find, peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard's uniform that undoubtedly smelled of its previous owner. The goal was to go unnoticed. But going unnoticed meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in weeks, limped from old wounds, and had nervous tics from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your cape. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in gauze. And forget about masks. There were no options for men. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversations, but terrible for getting into parties. If someone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I am Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and roof maintenance. Even assuming you made it past the guards, noble houses weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially those who twisted the chamber pots and didn't know what the cook's cat was called. You were never one of them. I've never seen you before, except when you were being hit with a candlestick. And if your disguise worked, congratulations. Now you had to maintain your character for hours while pretending not to notice all the people worthy of being stabbed who wandered around there. Also, wigs did not exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you had no choice but to smear your face with mud, squint, and hope no one got close enough to realize your beard was glued on with honey. The truth is that your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you about 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to disappear, become invisible, or be very convincing. And if someone realized, well, let's say nobody wants to be the killer caught in the bishop's laundry room dressed in a nun's habit and wielding a sword, and even less so on holiday. In the Middle Ages, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a partner with a crossbow, a clever alchemist in a secret lair, or a mentor giving you coded scrolls and words of encouragement. You only had yourself, a rusty dagger, and serious trust issues. There were no guilds, at least none you could trust. And if the existence of a brotherhood of assassins was rumored, it was mostly tavern talk fueled by me and boredom. You were more likely to encounter a ghost than another professional assassin who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew of your existence, the longer you would live. Each contact was a risk, each loose tongue a potential noose. Even your client might not know your real name. And if he knew it, you would already be planning your exit. Company. Ridiculous. Friends ask questions. Lovers notice the bruises, the blood stains, and why you always slept with a razor under the pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford it. One mistake, one person who recognized you in a market, and your whole life became a race to the nearest sewer. Even your fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You were that guy who made people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking danger. Nobody wanted to share stew with someone whose profession could attract a mob with torches. And don't expect compassion. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your work, people assumed you were lying or dangerous, and they weren't wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. In taverns, you sat in the darkest corner with your back to the wall, your eyes always fixed on the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than one night. You never said your name unless someone paid you first. And even then, it probably wasn't your real name. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of disappearing. Not only among the crowd, but from all the lives you never got to have. Let's say you accepted the job. You planned your route. You bribed the right doorman. You disguised yourself as a very convincing chimney sweep. And then you froze. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe he was with his son. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment, and your knife-wielding hand was shaking like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? Now you're dead. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a simple reprimand or bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and tremendously theatrical death, often including ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron instruments with names like the Bonebreaker's Delight. Failing the assassination meant ruining the entire operation completely. Your target survived and immediately told everyone everything. Suddenly, you were no longer in the shadows. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and probably a rough sketch nailed to tavern walls within 30 meters. And those guards you once dodged are now even more motivated. Sometimes you didn't even have to worry just about your target. It was your own client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset at all. You were now a burden, someone they could torture, interrogate, or even something worse. To talk. The same ones who paid you would be first to put a contract on your head, and there were absolutely no second chances. No, I'm very sorry. The sword slipped right from my hand. I'll just try again tomorrow. You had one chance, just one moment in time. And if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before someone found out who hired you anyway. Failure also simply meant shame. The silent and deeply humiliating shame. You had not only failed in your mission to kill someone, you had failed utterly to be invisible, in being truly perfect. And for assassins, perfection meant survival. Anything less than that was like painting a target on your back and starting to practice your own farewell speech. It didn't matter at all how many jobs you had done before. No one cared that you had been successful 12 times. Because in this profession, you're only as good as your last ever assassination. And if your last assassination was not carried out, you better start running fast. So you actually did it. The plan actually worked. The dagger hit its target. No screams, no guards, just a clean fall to the ground and a very important person who was no longer important. Congratulations to you. Now run quickly for your life. Because being a successful assassin in the Middle Ages did not mean drinking wine on a rooftop while the city burned behind. It meant fleeing through alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog sniffing closely your trail. There was no lap of honor, no drinks with colleagues after work, or even with your client. You didn't even have a moment to admire your own work. The moment your sword struck, your new job was to escape from everyone who now wanted to kill you in increasingly creative ways now. Guards approaching fast, doors closed, horses tied on the other side of the city now, probably actively bleeding. You had to plan your escape before the assassination itself. Routes, disguises, and emergency shelters. Perhaps a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions because the city would close in minutes. Nobody ever wanted scandal, and the closure meant closed doors, armed checkpoints, and a dozen furious men with swords who had just received your sketch and the phrase, perhaps armed and extremely dangerous. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they really intended to pay you, they weren't going to meet you in a cozy tavern with a smile and thank you card. They would probably disappear, too, because an assassin who has just completed a job is the most dangerous person in the world. You knew too much. You had shown that you could enter places where others could not. So, even when you were successful, you left with the coins in one hand and a huge target on your back. And what did you win? A week sleeping in stables, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian while trying to blend in with the monks heading east. Because success did not guarantee survival. It meant starting the whole game again in a new city, with a new name, and even more people looking for you this time. So yes, you killed. Now, run like hell. In case being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, persecuted, and sleeping in places that smelled like goat. You also had to deal with the wonderful and creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins were not only feared but considered cursed. For the average peasant, you were not just a hooded assassin. You were an unholy creature that whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your sword under a full moon. Why else could you sneak past guards and disappear into the darkness? Logic was not exactly popular then, but superstition, oh, that was everywhere. Some believed that assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed that you were invisible unless you bathed in holy water. A popular legend suggested that assassins allied with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a town and hearing a woman murmur, "Don't look him in the eyes." He could bewitch the baby. Even your tools seemed suspicious. You were carrying a dagger. It was clear that it had been forged in a cursed forge. You used poison. That wasn't chemistry. It was witchcraft, and you probably mixed it with a toe cut off under a blood moon. You might think that fear would help you. After all, people avoided you, didn't they? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs do not hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, set fires, and shout things like, "Burn him before he calls the lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. As soon as someone died unexpectedly from illness, accident, or choking on a chicken bone, someone whispered, maybe it was a shadow man. Maybe it was him. They could persecute you just for living in the same town as someone who had died suspiciously. That meant you had to keep moving. Always. If you stayed too long, suddenly a priest rang a bell while 5 enraged farmers wielded pitchforks as if they had been waiting for that moment their whole lives. And God help you if you were caught with something even remotely strange. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That was all it took for someone to shout "sorcerer" and light a torch. In a world that believed that monsters had human faces, being too quiet, too intelligent, or too fast made you a threat. And according to medieval logic, threats had to die quickly and, if possible, at the stake. The poison. The assassin's elegant weapon. A silent death, without dirtying, without screams, without steel against bones. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That is the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with an herbal infusion and bad attitude. First of all, poisons weren't reliable. One did not have access to purified cyanide or a pill labeled quick death. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, and perhaps the occasional toad. You had to collect, grind, and hunt. And even then, the only thing you could get was for the target to have a stomach ache and reinforce his commitment to his bodyguards. There were no scientific measures. It was not dosed precisely. It was calculated by a pinch less, and the noble vomited and canceled the dinner. A pinch too much, and you died of exposure before the first course. In addition, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just walk in and season the soup with belladonna. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in when no one was watching, or try to poison a meal that would go through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat. They treated it as a military operation. The meals were tasted, blessed, and smelled by everyone, from the butler to the jester. When the food reached the plate, It had gone through more security checks than a royal wedding. Even assuming you did, that you introduced the poison, that it was not detected, and that the target ate it, what happened next would be totally unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, others took days. One moment your target is laughing at a joke. The next, he grabs his stomach and demands to see his astrologer. And if they survived, who would they blame? Not the cook, nor the taster. You, the quiet man with knowledge of herbs and nervous eyes. So poisoning was not effective. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, a quick death would not await you. They interrogated you with instruments until you confessed to poisoning everyone, from the duke to the dog. You might think that if you managed to change the course of history by eliminating a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. But no, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, a hooded figure, a cold-eyed foreigner, or the quiet man who never finished his beer. You could have carried out the most legendary hit of the century and still end up as a mysterious death in official records. In fact, that was the goal. Your client didn't want a story. He wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who had done it, the safer they would be, and the less likely they would end up poisoned by their own assassin. Therefore, your name was buried the moment the job was completed. If you used a real one, you didn't sign your work. You didn't brag. You didn't keep trophies. You did not exist outside of the assassination. And if someone knew your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had short life. Forget about honor. There were no medals for silence. There were no stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with a dagger at night. If a noble wanted a statue, he commissioned one for himself. You received a wooden box, a nameless tomb, or if things went really wrong, your head on a pike with a label that said traitor. Sometimes your name was only known to curse it. You became a whispered warning. Don't mess with the king. Do you remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes. And the man who did it disappeared like a ghost. That was your legacy. Neither fame nor fear, just absence. You shouldn't leave a mark. You had to disappear. And if you stayed long enough to be known, it was a fatal mistake because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So you survived. You got the job done. You even got paid. A miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is go unnoticed. Keep your head down and trust that your client will keep the deal and protect your identity. Right? False. Because in the world of medieval murder, there was a more sacred rule than not getting caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person who pays you. Your client, be it a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and relaxed morality, did not hire you out of respect. He hired you because he needed you to do something horrible, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the job was completed, you became a burden. You knew too much. You knew who wanted whom dead, when, why, and possibly how much they would pay for it. That made you dangerous, not only to their enemies, but to them too. So what did they do? They disappeared you. They denied having met you. Or even worse, they sent someone else to eliminate you and close the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even cases in which clients hired two assassins, one to do the job and another to kill the first immediately afterwards. No refunds, just less risk. And if you dared to blackmail a client, to threaten exposure, that was very daring. And also your last mistake, because the powerful of the Middle Ages did not negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, something very unusual, they might pay you and leave you alone. But even then, you would have to assume that they were watching you from a distance with someone sharpening steel and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that could not speak, the shadow that could not stay. Not even success was enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's suppose that, somehow, you managed to overcome all adversities. You survived the murders, lies, poisonings, and betrayals. You have survived your enemies, your bosses, and probably your own morality. And now what? Retire. No way. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins had no retirement plans. There are no farewell banquets, quiet little houses by the sea, or pensions paid in gold coins in gratitude. You did not fade into a peaceful life. You disappeared or died, often both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you left the job, your past did not. You had too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you to retire. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant burying you. And even if no one was chasing you, and that's a big assumption, you had to live with the constant fear that someone would. That a new assassin, young and eager to prove worth, had just received a contract to kill a shadowy character who used to be dangerous. So you changed your name again. You moved to a town where no one asked questions. You pretended to limp, sold herbs, and pretended you had worked as a guard. But even so, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat in front of the door. You kept your dagger under the floor, next to the bag of coins that you never touched because it still smelled of the man you had taken it from. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent murders and quick escapes had affected your brain. Every knock made you jump. Any stranger on the road could recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was that there was no end for a medieval assassin. Only a slow, cold fading into the darkness. Always on the move, always watching, until one day you slip into darkness and no one notices. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably already realized, being a medieval assassin was not romantic or dark. It was not noble. It wasn't even that profitable. It was a dark, ungrateful, and ephemeral career, wrapped in blood-stained canvases and followed by a crowd of people who wanted to see you dead. You wouldn't last a week, maybe not even a day, because you would start with erroneous assumptions. You would believe that you would be elegant, that you would be in control, that you would be a whisper in darkness. But in reality, you would be cold, hungry, and one step away from the gallows. You would arrive in the city, with your cloak well adjusted, ready for action, only to discover that your target has moved. The guards are drunk, but with their finger on the trigger. And the stable boy you paid for information has sold you out for a jug of beer and a piece of bread. You would be paralyzed at the least opportune moment. You would stab the wrong person. The maid of someone who once saw your face near the chapel would recognize you. And suddenly you are no longer a shadow. You are the problem. And then what? You run. But you are not used to the medieval terrain. The mud, irregular cobblestones, the insane amount of chickens loose on the street. You slip, you fall, you are knocked down by a guard named Thomas who has just been abandoned and is looking for release. And let's assume you survive. Then you have to deal with the consequences. Without allies, or honor, or future, only whispers, suspicions, and the growing awareness that, even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hidden under a false name in a town that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And, frankly, you shouldn't try, because the life of an assassin was not great. It was a cruel machine that crushed people and spat out nothing more than shadows. It offered you power without peace and a purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing that awaited you at the end was silence. A silence that no one would question because no one would even remember that you were there. Before becoming the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympus was known as Mertale, a Melatian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed to descend from Achilles himself. And, regardless of whether the blood of heroes actually ran through her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born to stand on the sidelines of history. From a very young age, Myrtle was immersed in mystery and rituals. Her education was not only marked by politics, but also by prophecies, ecstatic rites, and reverence for the ancient gods. She was not the kind of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to snakes, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, in which women danced barefoot in the moonlight and invoked the divine in a state of trance. Her connection with the gods was not superficial. It was personal. She not only worshipped, but embodied it. According to ancient sources, probably written by terrified and captivated men, She had sacred snakes in her chambers and even allowed them to curl up next to her in bed. We will never know if this was true or if it was the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies. But it was etched. For her allies, that made her divine. For her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her true power did not begin on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the disturbing flicker of torchlight among the whispers of priestesses and the coiled bodies of snakes. She was not just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedonia, brutal, brilliant, and famous for his lust, arrived on the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he not only met a beautiful princess. He met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage was not just a political alliance. It was a collision between prophecy and power. And from the beginning, it was full of omens. Some said that a lightning bolt fell from the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed that Olympia dreamed of a lightning bolt entering her womb. All of this would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympia and Philip not only gave rise to a son, it gave rise to Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from his first breath. The marriage of Olympia with Philip II was not the fairy tale expected from a queen who would one day give birth to an empire. From the beginning, it was an explosive mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives as trophies, married Olympia around the year 357 AC. She was probably just a teenager, but she was not naive. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition equaled hers, and perhaps a divine match for her spiritual destiny. Macedonia was not exactly an easy kingdom to govern. It was a land of iron and ambition, where kings were assassinated by cousins and brothers became rivals overnight. But Olympia, the priestess of Papiro, entered with her head held high and her gaze set on the crown. Her marriage was stormy from the start. Philip, despite his political genius, was not made for monogamy. He would marry several women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympia was not one to remain silent in the shadows. She had her own court, maintained her alliances, and was known for resorting to oracles and rites to guess her future and, perhaps, Philip's destiny. Then came the birth of Alexander, even though it was wrapped in a celestial drama. Legends say that Olympia dreamed a lightning bolt struck her belly and that the flames danced around her son without burning him. It is said that Philip had a vision in which he sealed his wife's belly with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed in these visions or invented them, the truth is that they acted as if Alexander was destined to govern not only a kingdom, but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, the cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympia resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian girlfriend, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he later married. This was more than just a domestic problem. It was a threat. Cleopatra was of Macedonian origin, and any child she had would be seen as pure by the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's future. Olympia saw it clearly. The palace was not just a home. It was a battlefield, and she would use all the snakes, dreams, rituals, and whispers at her disposal to ensure that her son was not only remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle. Now she was Olympus, and no one would take the throne from her son without facing her anger. When Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace of Pella had become a battlefield of veiled insults, political maneuvers, and fierce rivalries. Olympia was not only fighting for influence, she was fighting for survival. She knew that the court was full of snakes, but she was the one who had taught them to bite. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and, perhaps worst of all, listening more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, who should not be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was of Macedonian origin, and her uncle Attalus was one of Philip's main generals. For Olympia, it was not just a betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The wedding ceremony was a disaster. At the banquet, Attalus, drunk, mocked Olympia and Alexander, questioning the legitimacy of the latter's birth. Was he really Philip's son, or was he the son of a god, as Olympia liked to claim? It was an insult, but Olympia took advantage of the myth. Let them whisper. They believed their son was touched by Zeus. That made him untouchable. Alejandro left the banquet furious. Olympia abandoned Macedonia and retired to Apris. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a strategy. In her native land, she was still royalty. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and see how Filippo's palace began to rot from within. She did not need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then the shockwave arrived. Filippo was murdered at his daughter's wedding, just when he was about to invade Persia. Just when he was to be crowned not only king of Macedonia, but also potential emperor of the known world. The question that resonated in all the marble corridors and torchlit halls was the same. Who did it? Was it Porcinius, the heartbroken bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it Alejandro himself? Or, whispering softly, was it Olimpo? No one could prove it. No one dared, but many believed it. After all, in a matter of days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn son were dead. Murdered, according to some, by Olimpo herself. The snake had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Filippo dead and Macedonia plunged into mourning and confusion, Olympia made her move. While others rushed to understand the chaos, she acted with speed, brutality, and decision. First, she eliminated Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife. According to chilling accounts, Olympia did not limit herself to killing her. She made her death symbolic, public, and humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her newborn daughter murdered. Others claim Olympia had the girl thrown into a funeral pyre. What everyone agrees on is that no mercy was shown. Olympia understood what many mothers of the ancient court refused to accept. In a royal palace, piety is a burden. A rival son, however small, is a future war. And Olympia was done playing defensively. With Cleopatra and her lineage eliminated, she could focus all her attention on securing Alejandro's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, and already trained by Aristoteles, was declared king without serious opposition. But don't be fooled. It was not only his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Olympia. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to eliminate discreetly. She was not only protecting her son's rise, she was plotting it. Alejandro himself did not always approve. It is said that he disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family. But he did not stop her either because, deep down, he knew what Olympia had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedonia, blood ties were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympia began to withdraw slightly from public life. But this was not a retirement. She simply went from open attacks to silent influence. While Alejandro was preparing to launch his conquest of Persia, she stayed behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals in his name. To Olimpo, her son's mission was not only military. It was divine. Alejandro was not going to war. He was fulfilling a prophecy. And as long as she was alive, no rival, whether Macedonian, Persian, or from anywhere else, could frustrate that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had cleansed the palace. Now she would protect her empire from behind the curtain with clenched teeth. While Alejandro marched east to conquer the known world, Olimpo remained in Macedonia. A queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother. But make no mistake, she ruled in everything but name. Although the regency was technically given to Antipater, one of Alejandro's trusted generals, Olimpo refused to be left out. She wrote letters to her son, constantly advising him, warning him, and sometimes reprimanding him. They were not the sweet letters of a loving mother. They were political reports full of oracles and poison. And Alejandro, thousands of kilometers away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his flirtation with calling himself a god. No one else dared to tell him those things. But Olympia was never afraid to speak as a mother or as a priestess of divine will. In Macedonia, Antipater felt increasingly resentful. Olympia undermined him at every step. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir up opposition against him. She had influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and in Olympo, a whisper could be more lethal than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alejandro became more urgent. She warned him of Antipater's ambition, describing him as a second Filippo, willing to betray and usurp. Whether she really believed it or simply feared losing her power, she kept pressuring her son to act. Alejandro, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he fought in Asia. And so the gap between mother and general widened. Olympia weicht. She waited, but under her religious robes and her maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She had not endured years of palace wars to end up being ruled by an old soldier. As Alejandro's empire stretched from the Ion to India, Olympia saw the first cracks forming. He was taking on too many responsibilities, trusting too many foreign advisors, and turning away from his mother and the gods who had created him. She believed that his victories came from divine favor and from herself. And if he forgot it, well, Olympo knew how to remind kings who they really were, even if that king was her own son. When the news of Alejandro's death in Babylonia reached Macedonia in 323 AC, it did not arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a dagger. For Olympia, it was not just the loss of son. It was the collapse of a world that she had spent decades building. Her child, the divine storm that she had prophesied, raised, and unleashed, was gone. And she had left behind not a clean heir, nor a single successor, only chaos. The powerful empire that he forged was already fracturing. The generals, his supposed successors, were already dividing it like jackals over a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedonia and Greece, and felt no love for Olympia. Worse still, his daughter Cleopatra, Alejandro's sister, was being courted by rival generals for marriage, each hoping to use her lineage as a claim to the throne. Olympia saw what was coming. Civil war was not a possibility. It was inevitable, and once again, she would have to act. But she no longer had Alejandro. What she had instead was her lineage. Her young son, Alejandro IV, born of Roxana, the Bactrian princess whom Alejandro had married. Roxana, still in Macedonia, was vulnerable. The child was even more so. Olympia recognized that the baby was now the last authentic piece of her son's legacy, making him a target, but also a weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the child, determined to protect them and to use the child's birthright to claim her own right on the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The generals who once bowed before Alejandro had no interest in kneeling before his widow or mother. Now they had armies, ambitions, and grudges. Olympia did not flinch. She had faced snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with stolen crowns and spears did not scare her. So she hatched a plan. She waited. She watched how Antipater died and was replaced by his son, Cassandro, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided. Alejandro's mother snake and the cold-eyed manipulator who wanted to bury her. Alejandro had died, but his shadow continued to move, and Olympia was still coiled in it, ready to attack. Years after Alejandro's death, while his empire crumbled in civil war, Olympia took her boldest step yet. She returned to Macedonia, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The regency had fragmented. Cassandro, the son of her old enemy, Antipater, was taking power, and Roxana, along with the young Alejandro IV, was practically imprisoned. Olympia saw what was coming. If she did not act now, Her grandson would disappear like a shadow at sunset. So she made a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still retained a glimpse of legitimate authority. Olympia would return, not to beg, but to rule. With the backing of Polyperchon, she entered Macedonia at the head of an army. And the moment her feet touched native soil, everything changed. The cities opened their doors. The soldiers deserted to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympia, despite her age, was still a name that made the earth tremble. Then came her revenge. One by one, she hunted down Cassandro's loyalists. And when she finally caught Felipe III, Arrhetius, Alejandro's mentally disabled half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the opportunity to commit suicide. When she refused, Olympia had her strangled. It was brutality veiled by royal protocol, and Olympia, always theatrical, staged the scene as a goddess dispensing justice. Her message was clear. Only Alejandro's lineage had the right to govern. Everyone else were impostors. During a brief, ardent moment, Olympia had the kingdom in her hands. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged the betrayals. She had reminded Macedonia what royal power was like when exercised by a woman who had nothing to lose. But power in Macedonia was like fire in the... And Cassandro was still out there, calculating, awaiting his moment. He returned with a thirst for revenge. His army outnumbered hers, his resources greater, and his cruelty colder. Her allies began abandoning her. Polyperchon lost influence. The tide had changed. Olympo, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies approached. She had lit the fuse. Masdan had burned, and now the smoke was thick and her enemies at the gates. Olympus, who had once been the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone and isolated, surrounded by Cassandra's army, who had come to finish what her father had started. But Olympus did not plead. She did not implore. For almost a year, she endured the siege like a statue sculpted by divine wrath. Food was scarce. Diseases spread. The allies disappeared. However, within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unwavering presence that had once made kings tremble. Until the end, she did not behave like a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassandra, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew that killing Olympia was dangerous. Even now, she carried a myth with her as if it were armor. She was still Alejandro Magno's mother. Killing her might seem blasphemous, so he offered security. If she surrendered, he told her he would spare her life. Olympia knew that was not the case. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ashes. Even so, hunger was no longer just an annoyance. It was death. Her garrison surrendered. Her followers surrendered. And Olympia, inflexible to the end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassandra did not kill her himself. That would have been too simple and merciful. Instead, he handed her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return of power. Let them decide her fate. They sentenced her to death. But here is the crux. When the executioners arrived, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympia stood upright, majestic, silent, her eyes fixed on them like an oracle looking through smoke. They were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing about their rituals, their visions, and their snakes. In another time, they had acclaimed her son as a living god. And now, there she was, a frail old woman wrapped in myth. And not a single man had the courage to wield the sword. So Cassandra sent others, foreigners, strangers, people who did not remember her power, only had orders to fulfill. And so, Olympia was finally overthrown, not with ceremony nor dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alejandro's lineage in any significant power, and with him, the last ember of an empire founded on divine ambition. But even in death, Olympo left a shadow behind, and history would never forget the Snake Queen. Olympo did not die on a throne, but in the dust, disarmed, abandoned, and executed by the same people she once ruled. But history is strange. It does not always favor those who die between silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who die hissing. And Olympo was never destined for a quiet story. In life, she had wielded motherhood as a sword and prophecy as a shield. She was not only the mother of Alejandro Magno, she was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, the myth of the divine child would not exist. There would be no rituals that whisper of lightning and lions. There would be no ruthless purges of rivals that paved the way for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympo not only gave birth to an empire, she defended it tooth and nail. However, even among the most ruthless dynasts of the ancient world, Olympia stands above all. She did not lead armies on the battlefield like Cleopatra, nor ride in a battle like Boudicca. Her battlefield was more subtle and cold. It was a world of poison cups, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear and, more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe that her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, witch, and manipulator, and they were not wrong. Olympia was all that and much more. She was the product of a brutal world that respected cunning much more than goodness. And she learned early that mercy was a luxury that queens could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she was vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted Alejandro's legacy like a ghost, always in the background, always behind the curtain. And perhaps that was precisely her place. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in the history of a king, but as a story in itself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecies, slept next to snakes, and survived the gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures in all the stories of ruthless queens. In every whisper of inherited destiny, in every empire built on myth, she is still there, coiled in the darkness, waiting. On the island of Crete, bleached by the sun, a few kilometers south of the modern city of Heracleion, there are ruins that seem more like a dream than a real place. Stone corridors meander in all directions. The rooms twist and turn. The stairs lead nowhere. It is easy to lose your sense of direction, even today. This place is Kenosis, the heart of the Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in the history of mankind, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before the legend, there was a palace unlike any other. Built around 1900 AC and expanded over centuries, Knos was not only a royal residence. It was an entire city under a roof. It covered almost 150,000 square feet. It had more than 1,000 rooms, light wells, warehouses, sanctuaries, workshops, and what may have been the first flushing toilets. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and a complex air system. It was not some primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. For modern archaeologists, Knos seems like organized chaos. For visitors of antiquity, it probably seemed like magic. The man who made Knos known to the modern world was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. At the start of the 20th century, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was the origin of the Greek myth of the labyrinth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and everywhere he looked, he found bull motifs painted on walls, carved in stone, or sculpted in small gold amulets. After all, the bull was sacred for Minoans. Evans even named the civilization after the mythical king Minos. Regardless of whether Minos was real, his legend became inseparable from the ruins. But here's a twist. No one has found a literal labyrinth. There is no underground labyrinth, no prison chambers, no mythological monsters. Instead, what we have is something far more mysterious. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately hard to navigate. And the further you go, the more history and mythology blur. So the question remains, was the Minotaur born within these walls, or was the palace itself a monster? Knos may not give us answers easily, but it is very good at making us ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruins. A half-man, half-bull monster trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered managed to get out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to kill the beast and escape thanks to a ball of thread and the cunning of Princess Ariadne. But where does this story originate? And why a labyrinth? The first versions of the myth speak of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded from Athens a tribute of 7 boys and 7 girls each year. These souls were handed over to the Minotaur, a creature born of divine punishment and shame. The Minotaur, locked in an underground labyrinth, symbolized the dark side of power, something wild hidden behind greatness. For the ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. Its seafaring people, the Minoans, were considered elegant and strange. Their rituals included bull leaping, their works of art depicted strange gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the continent. For a Greek visitor from the year 1000 A.C., Nos might have seemed like another world. The bull itself was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes show young men and women jumping over bulls that charge in ritual displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, appear on roofs and altars. If we add to this a palace that looks like a labyrinth, the ingredients for a legend begin to take shape. But what if the Minotaur was not just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars believe that the legend reflects the memory of Cretan rule over the Achaeans, a time when Athens paid tribute to a stronger, stranger power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker states, and the Minotaur, the brute and terrifying force behind the rule of the Manios. Others argue that it's more psychological. The labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden impulses, and Theseus as the hero who walks bravely into darkness, guided only by the thread of memory. Even so, the myth remains intertwined with Nos. The palace is the closest thing to a real labyrinth that we've found. Without monsters, without Ariadne, but perhaps something deeper. Not only a myth that resonates throughout history, but a story that asked to become one. Long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears, the Minoan civilization existed, one of Europe's first advanced societies. They did not govern through conquest, but through commerce, art, and what seems an almost supernatural mastery of architecture. At the center of their power was Knossos, a palace that was not only the seat of royalty. It was a cultural, ritual, and economic center. The hands flourished between 2600 and 400 AC. Based on Crete, they developed an extensive commercial network that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant coasts of Spain. Their ships sailed the Mediterranean like silent arrows, transporting ceramics, saffron, bronze, and luxury items. They did not build large armies. They built relationships, and that, more than weapons, made them rich. The most striking thing about the Minoan culture is how different it was from its later Greek successors. Their works of art celebrated nature, animals, and the fluid movement of human beings, not war or divine punishment. The frescoes show dancers, dolphins, and athletes jumping over bulls. Even their goddesses are different. Powerful figures with bare breasts who often hold snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of everything was Knossos, not a fortress on a hill, but a complex in a fertile valley. It did not have massive defensive walls, suggesting that the Minoans felt safe on their island or projected enough power to make defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. The multi-story buildings, columned courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems pointed to a society far ahead of its time. And yet, despite all their sophistication, the Minoans left no deciphered written record. Their main writing, linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what their kings believed in, what prayers they recited, or what really happened behind the walls of Knossos. All we have are its ruins, its art, and its influence, later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and reflected in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just palace builders. They were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not just a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization that shone for a moment like sunlight on the Aegean and then disappeared. But some say its echo still wanders the labyrinth. Walking through Knossos is walking through time. A confusing, beautiful, and layered time. It is not only the scale that overwhelms you. It is the design. The rooms lead to other rooms. The corridors divide and disappear. The light wells cross the heart of the building. The stairs curl into the shadows or suddenly emerge into sunny courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. It is not difficult to understand why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. Knossos was not just a palace. It was a living organism. With an estimated area of 150,000 square feet, the complex contained more than 1,000 chambers, some tiny, others grandiose. These are not randomly placed rooms. They were workshops, warehouses, sanctuaries, apartments, and throne rooms, all built expressly, arranged around a large central courtyard that may have housed public ceremonies or bull-leaping rituals. The palace was built on several levels, up to 4 or 5 stories high in some places, using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To travel it without getting lost, you would need memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus's. And yet, this apparent chaos conceals an extraordinary intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air ducts and open staircases. They channeled rainwater through clay pipes and had toilets with cisterns well before they became fashionable in Rome. One of the most emblematic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair embedded in the wall and flanked by benches. Around it, there are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, the chamber of a goddess, or a sacred court? No one knows for sure, and the walls speak in colors. Vibrant frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women with elegant frilly skirts and bare breasts, young people jumping over bulls in midair. Art was not just decoration. It was identity, fluid, natural, deeply connected to the earth and the sea. However, the more you go in, the more Knossos disorients you. Some parts seem intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse. Perhaps therein lies the origin of the labyrinth legend. It was not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that inspired awe, ritual, and a slight fear. There are no closed doors, no mythical beasts. Only a place built to make you question where you are and what awaits around the corner. Knossos was not only an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, imbued with rituals, myths, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no imposing columns dedicated to Zeus or marble sanctuaries to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, interwoven into the very structure of the building. The sanctuaries are hidden in corners. The pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Stylized, carved, and symbolic horns appear on the roofs and altars. Wherever you look, the bull motif predominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this venerated animal. The Minoans did not seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The famous fresco of bull jumping in Knossos is not just athletic art. It may represent a religious rite. Young men and women jumping over a charging bull, engaged in a dance of danger and grace. It was not a sport. It was a sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses discovered in the warehouses under the palace, whose figurines are among the most emblematic artifacts of Minoa. With bare breasts, raised arms, and snakes coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are guardians of the home, of fertility, and perhaps of life itself. For the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery, creatures of both the earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found suggest domestic sanctuaries or ritual spaces, quiet, sacred corners hidden in the bustling heart of the palace. In combination with the fresco, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to look like a ritual machine, a structure built not only to live, but to connect with the divine. In Knossos, there is no centralized temple because the palace itself was a temple. Its distribution, its art, and its design were part of a spiritual worldview in which there were no boundaries between the sacred and secular. It was a place where mythology was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers could once have been a whispered prayer. Knossos not only housed people, it housed gods. For centuries, Knos was a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then something happened, sudden, something that no one can fully explain. Towards the year 1400 AC, the palace was abandoned, the frescoes faded, and the Minoan civilization that once dominated the seas disappeared like fog over the Aegean. What happened? The theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1600 AC, the volcanic island of Thera, today Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in mankind's history. The explosion was so great that it probably caused tsunamis that lashed CIT's north coast, devastating ports and farmland. The ash clouds may have blocked the sun, suffocating crops and altering climate. Although Knossos was not destroyed immediately, the eruption's aftermath may have shaken the economic, political, and spiritual foundations. Others point to war. Towards 1450 A.C., the growing power of the Mycenaeans, Greeks from the continent, may have taken advantage of the Minoans' weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests that Knos was briefly reoccupied, but its culture had changed. The art became more martial. Linear A, the Minoan writing, was replaced by Linear B, used by the Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and dancers now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe that the Mycenaeans did not invade in a single conquest, but gradually absorbed the island, first through trade, then influence, and finally dominance. Others argue that internal collapse, civil uprising, political instability, or elite failure may have contributed as well. What is striking, however, is how little violence can be seen in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no signs of mass killings. Knos did not fall with a scream. It fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply stopped. The rooms fell silent. The rituals ended, and nature slowly returned. When Homer sang about Crete in his epics, Knos was already an ancient myth, a memory entangled in stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And perhaps that is appropriate, because what killed Knos was not just an eruption or invasion. It was time, and the way all great things, however beautiful, end up disappearing under new empires. But the bones remain, and if you listen carefully, the labyrinth continues to hum under the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos remained buried under the Cretan soil. It was just another mound of stones lost to time, its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls engulfed by olive groves and dust, until a man decided to pursue a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he not only rediscovered Knossos, but reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a talent for drama and a deep love of Homeric myths, bought the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers have been finding strange seals and artifacts, clues that something huge lay beneath their feet. Evans out of work. What he found would forever change the history of Asia. He discovered a palace so vast, so complex, and so advanced that he became convinced that it was the mythical home of King Minos. The frescoes, the horns, the strange architecture of the place. Everything pointed in his mind toward one thing, the labyrinth. Evans was not just an archaeologist. He was a storyteller and, at times, a controversial one. He baptized the inhabitants of Knossos as Manoan, in honor of Minos. He interpreted symbols, reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a decision that aroused both praise and criticism. Some call him a visionary, others vandalism. Because what is seen today in Knossos is partly ancient ruins and partly Edwardian imagination. Even so, Evans did what no one else dared to do. He gave life back to Knossos. He offered Europe a vision of a Bronze Age world much older than classical Greece, a civilization of art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also unearthed a linear writing still undeciphered, which opened new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than just excavate stones. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to recognize that behind the legend of the labyrinth, there was something real, something complex, something very human. A palace that looked like a labyrinth, a civilization that slipped into the shadows, and a man who unearthed the earth only to discover a story much stranger and more beautiful than he had imagined. It had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that woke it up. Walking through Knossos is not just walking through architecture. It is walking through a language of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, patterns are everywhere. But the Manawans did not leave us a Rosetta Stone. Its main writing, linear, remains undeciphered. So, instead of reading their thoughts, we must see them painted on the plaster, carved on the walls, and hidden in patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of Knossos is unlike anything else in the ancient world. There is no obsession with war, no rows of kings or heroes hardened in 1,000 battles. Instead, we find nature, jumping dolphins, lilies in bloom, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. Humans are alive, elegant, and often dance or perform rituals. Even in scenes that suggest danger, there's rhythm and beauty. The Minoans were not narrating conquests. They were celebrating the cycles of life and possibly the cosmic order. The most emblematic symbol, however, is the double axe or labrys. It is found throughout Knossos, in shrines, in frescoes, and even engraved in stones. The double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly related to the feminine divinity or celestial cycles. Some suggest that the word labyrinth itself could derive from labrys, which would make the labyrinth not a labyrinth at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed on the upper walls and altars. These could have been religious markers that separated the sacred space from the mundane. In combination with the frequent depictions of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it is clear that the animal had a profound spiritual meaning. No one agrees on whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or divine presence. But the bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Knossos may have a symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe that it was not built only for its functionality, but to reflect celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, death, the underworld, a spiritual labyrinth, not a physical prison. But without a deciphered writing, all theories move on a thin line between intuition and imagination. The Minoans spoke with symbols, not stories. So we are left to interpret. What does Knossos tell us? We hear the rhythms. We see the images, but the meaning escapes us like a thread that unravels into myth. Knossos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't seem dead. If you walk its corridors today, you will feel something murmuring just under the surface. They are not ghosts or gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that refuse to disappear. Thousands of years after its fall, Knossos continues to trap us in its labyrinth. Tourists wander through its rooms, archaeologists look for answers, and writers weave new stories inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the sensation of the labyrinth is real. We do not know who governed Knossos. We do not know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We do not know the prayers they whispered, nor the laws by which they were governed. But we know that they loved beauty. We know that they adored nature. We know that they understood the balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know that they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or Persian palaces, Knossos existed. A palace that was also a city that was also a temple, A temple that could also have been a story, because perhaps that is what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, nor a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not arise from nothing. It comes from this place, from the confusion of its corridors, from the reverence of its bullfighting rituals, and from the amazement that it inspired in generations that tried to make sense of it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology. But deep down, Knossos has always been both things. Today we can walk through its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, and even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery has not disappeared. The line between reality and legend still shines like heat on stone. Perhaps that is why Knossos endures, because it does not give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history is not destined to be resolved. It is destined to be felt. And Knossos, ancient, tangled, half-forgotten, is not just a place on a map. It is a question, one that takes us deeper with each step. And like Theseus, we all follow the thread. The ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The first battering rams were manual. Teams of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and crashed it against enemy defenses like crazed lumberjacks. But over time, the battering ram evolved. Engineers realized that mounting the battering ram inside a wheeled frame, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, turned it from a tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, turned battering rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined battering rams with platforms for archers, which meant that the gates of a city were destroyed while the defenders were under constant fire. The reliefs of Nineveh show battering rams with sharp iron tips rolling towards the gates of rebellious cities like slowly moving gods of destruction. And they didn't just smash the front door. Battering rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, knock down watchtowers, or completely collapse gates. Their presence meant one thing: surrender or watch the defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks perfected them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built huge battering rams called ares, which means ram in Latin, suspended with chains or ropes inside huge siege shelters. Some were so large that they needed dozens of men to handle them. It was said that the rhythm of its oscillating beam sounded like thunder rumbling on stone. However, despite their brute strength, battering rams required great teamwork. Operators had to keep the battering ram swinging in sync while defending it from incendiary projectiles, stones, and all sorts of disgusting substances thrown from above. A stuck battering ram was a dead battering ram. Even so, when a battering ram really got going, it was unstoppable. Wooden muscle against human masonry. It was ancient physics turned into a weapon, and it was only the beginning of how engineers would make the walls fall. If the battering ram was brute force, the catapult was the strategist. While the battering rams struck up close, the catapults attacked from a distance, launching not only stones, but also psychological terror. They were the first true artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by turning physics into a weapon that seemed almost magical to enemies. The first catapults emerged in the Greek world around the 4th century BC. See, the fruit of brilliant minds that wanted to add reach and impulse to war. Dionysius of Syracuse, a tyrant with a taste for extreme violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These were not slings for giants, but precise instruments to terrorize during sieges. The genius resided in their mechanics. The engineers discovered that by twisting tightly ropes, often made of animal sinew, they could store enormous potential energy. When released, this force could launch stones, javelins, or even incendiary projectiles hundreds of meters. The two main types evolved quickly. The ballista, which launched huge projectiles like a giant crossbow, and the catapult, which launched rocks over walls or directly against fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who never found a Greek idea they could not improve. They built catapults that could be disassembled, loaded onto carts, and reassembled at the place of use. portable siege machines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could launch 27-kilogram stones at incredible speeds, capable of breaking through wooden doors, battlements, and unfortunate soldiers. Catapults were not used only to destroy. They were also a spectacle. The generals of antiquity used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were thrown over the walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were thrown at besieged cities to shatter morale. In a chilling case, diseased bodies were thrown into enemy territory as a primitive form of biological warfare. But catapults had their weaknesses. They were heavy, required expert crews, and could be rendered useless by the terrain. Even so, when properly installed, they could subdue a city from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized that their thick stone walls not only had to withstand a battering ram, they had to survive the skies. Because now destruction came flying. If the catapult was ingenious, the trebuchet was majestic, imposing, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied on gravity. Its principle was simple. A swing arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterweight at one end and a sling at the other. By lifting the weight and releasing it, the arm swung, launching the sling and its deadly load in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled, precise, predictable, and devastating destruction. The origin of a trebuchet goes back to the first traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BC. In which human force replaced the counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe got hold of the design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. Its power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 136 kilograms projectiles over 300 m. Stones the size of furniture crashed into towers, pulverized walls, or shattered the enemy's morale. But the real magic was in the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could launch projectiles over walls with precision. This meant that they not only destroyed defenses, but reached the courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside. And not only did they throw stones, but the trebuchets threw everything. Sick animals, burning pitch, vessels with lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped in stones. A legendary account of the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland speaks of Warwolf, a catapult so enormous that the enemy surrendered even before it fired. The king refused to accept the surrender just to be able to test the machine. But despite its destructive glory, the catapult was not fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload it, and demanded expert engineers. Even so, no other siege weapon combined range, strength, and psychological terror like it. It was the medieval version of a slow-motion hammer launched from the sky. And when the counterweight fell, the cities held their breath. While the catapults launched projectiles from afar and the battering rams smashed the doors, the siege towers took a more personal approach. They rolled to the main door of the enemy and dropped armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels covered in wet skins to avoid fire, full of archers and spearmen. That was the assault tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored troop, transport vehicle, and mobile fortress, all in one. And when one of these began to roar towards your city walls, you knew that the real battle was about to begin. The assault towers were not subtle. They were large, bold, and terribly effective when used correctly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to use them in the 9th century ACC, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, that took the design to theatrical extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 ACC, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called Heliopolis, or City Conqueror. It was more than 30 meters high, was equipped with catapults, covered with iron plates, and moved by thousands of soldiers. It also collapsed under its own weight. But the ambition was unmatched. The logic behind the siege towers was simple. The walls only work if they cannot be overcome. The siege towers eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which the attackers could descend to the battlements, without going through the doors or climbing stairs. From the upper deck, the archers could launch a deadly rain on the defenders, while the troops on the lower levels prepared to board. But these towers were not invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to mud, and priority targets for defenders with incendiary arrows, rolling rocks, or even sabotage terrain. Smart defenders dug ditches, flooded moats, or built secondary interior walls, known as counterscarp defenses, just to stop the advance of a tower. Even so, when they worked, they did so spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own wall suddenly crowded with enemy soldiers was chaos. The siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They made height both an advantage and a disadvantage. And once the walkway was dropped from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was the moment of melee hell. While the battering rams smashed and the catapults flew, some of the most devastating siege tactics were carried out silently underground. The construction of siege, or undermining tunnels, was the dark art of defeating a city by removing the ground on which it sat. Literally, the idea was old and terribly effective. It was dug under the enemy wall, propped up with wooden supports, and then those supports were set on fire. When the wood burned, the tunnel collapsed, taking with it the foundations of the wall. In one moment, your city stood firm. The next, a huge section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method did not seem glorious. There were no great machines or thunderous launches, but tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced primitive versions, but the technique reached its fullness with the Greeks, the Persians, and, later, the medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 CC, the Spartans tried to dig tunnels under the walls, but the defenders dug counter-tunnels and intercepted them in the middle of the excavation, turning the earth into a nightmare of knife fighting. This defensive tactic is known as countermine and added a disturbing element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in absolute darkness, hundreds of meters underground, listening to the sound of the enemy's picks. As soon as they heard a blow, they ran to intercept them, which often led to violent claustrophobic skirmishes in the light of torches, with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just terror, asphyxia, and dirt. But when the undermining worked, results proved catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples occurred in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces dug a tunnel under the south wall, filled it with pork fat, and set it on fire. The supports collapsed, knocking down the entire tower on top. The defenders were stunned and soon surrendered. In the 13th century, siege engineers became specialists in identifying weak foundations, measuring soil behavior, and planning collapses with precision. They were geologists and demolition experts in one. And although digging tunnels required time, labor, and some madness, it proved a truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't jump over the wall or break through, you could always knock it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came solely from the attackers. For every battering ram built or advanced tower, the defenders had their own deadly tricks. And sometimes those tricks were red hot. Let's begin with the most terrifying of all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century AD.C., Greek fire was a mysterious napalm-like substance that stuck to ships, walls, and flesh, and burned even in water. Sprayed from siphons or thrown in clay vessels, it created scenes of chaos. To this day, no one knows how it was made. The formula was so secret that it died with the empire, but its effects remained legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes. And that was just the start. In less technological defenses, boiling liquids became the weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand was poured from the murder holes, openings in the roofs of gates or towers, directly onto the invaders below. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it stuck to skin and soaked clothing and armor before catching fire. Imagine climbing an assault ladder and facing a fire you could never extinguish. Hot sand, although less spectacular, proved equally cruel. It slipped through gaps in the armor, especially around the neck or wrists, and caused second- and third-degree burns by cooking the flesh underneath. It didn't seem impressive from a distance, but it turned brave warriors into screaming ruins in a matter of seconds. The defenders also used the old laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were thrown from the battlements against siege engines or troop formations. The goal was not just to kill. It was to break the machines and morale in one fell swoop. And then there were the traps. Hidden pits, collapsing bridges, barricades with spikes. Castles became puzzles of pain designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All with a single objective: delay. Every minute a wall held was 1 minute closer to the enemy supply lines running out, diseases spreading, or reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a game of attrition. And while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders had creativity and much seething rage. In siege warfare, pure destruction was only half of the goal. The other half was psychological dominance, breaking the will of defenders before the walls even fell. Siege weapons were not just tools of war. They were huge, creaking, flaming symbols of doom. Every wheel that groaned on an assault tower, every rock launched by a catapult was designed to plant a seed in the minds of those behind the walls. You're not safe. The ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians openly displayed their siege engines, dragging them through deserts with fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps in sight of the enemy, letting the defenders observe how the battering rams were assembled and the catapults were tested. The siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes, the loads themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals were thrown over the walls, often still armored. In the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded with not only stones, but corpses. Infected corpses were thrown to sow panic and plague. It is believed that during the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, throwing plague-infected corpses over the walls contributed to outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet was more than a weapon. It was an announcement. When one of these giants was put in place, everyone inside the fortress heard it before seeing it. The squeak of winches, the creaking ropes, the heavy blow of the counterweight, like the beat of a coming storm. But the most dangerous thing was the unknown. You never knew what would come next. Would it be a rock, a barrel of fire, a rain of arrows, or just silence? A heavy, sinister silence while the engineers adjusted their aim. Even sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic blow of a battering ram or sudden silence before a shot drove defenders crazy with anticipation. For commanders, the goal was to create despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was useless, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were merely temporary obstacles in the path of destiny. And when that mental dike finally broke, the doors often opened without a fight. Because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed before the masonry. When gunpowder exploded on the battlefield in the late Middle Ages, the era of traditional siege engines came to a slow, fragmented end. But its legacy did not disappear. It evolved. The invention of cannons changed everything. A single well-aimed cannon shot could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to achieve. The stone walls, previously considered impenetrable, became a liability. In the 15th century, the great castles of Europe fell, not by undermining or fire, but by the iron balls that pierced their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet, the principles established by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. All ballistic missiles and long-range howitzers are merely high-tech descendants of the same question. How do you break something that is supposed to be unbreakable from afar? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder came on the scene. Even the current military psychology, the shock and awe, the overwhelming power, the visible dominance, has its roots in the ancient siege tactics. Those imposing siege machines that advanced with flags waving in the wind were the original shock and awe. It was not just about tearing down a wall. It was about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still see its legacy engraved in the ruins of ancient cities. In Masada, where the Roman siege ramps still mark the desert. In Constantinople, where layers of walls resisted for 1,000 years against all imaginable machines. Until the cannons finally knocked them down in castles throughout Europe, where round towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world constantly redesigned to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare has not disappeared. It has simply been digitized. Cities are still surrounded. The defenders are still isolated. The walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the soul of the siege remains the same. Someone wants to enter. Someone wants to prevent them from passing. And both are willing to wait, build, and destroy to win. The rams have now disappeared. The catapults are museum relics. But the spirit of siege warfare remains as alive and destructive as ever.